My name is Sarah, and I work as a night babysitter to help pay for college. That night, I was looking after two kids, Emily, who's 6, and Jake, who's 8. The house they live in is like a real mansion, totally different from my tiny apartment. It's in a wealthy neighborhood with wide, well-lit streets, the kind of place where you'd feel safe, even if you were alone. Emily and Jake's parents had gone out to an important event, leaving me in charge of everything. The kids were already in their pajamas when I arrived, so after playing with them for a bit and making sure they did their homework, I tucked them into bed. Emily stayed in her pink room, surrounded by dolls and stuffed animals. Jake, being more adventurous, preferred a dinosaur-themed environment. After a bedtime story for each of them, they quickly fell asleep. With the kids asleep, I settled into the living room. It was a modern house, filled with the latest gadgets. One of them was an intercom system that the parents used to monitor the kids' rooms. They showed me how it worked, and I left it on next to me, the volume low, while I watched TV. Everything was peaceful. The house was so quiet that I could almost hear the ticking of the clock. I let myself relax on the couch, thinking it would be another easy night. That's when I heard the first strange sound over the intercom. It sounded like a distant whisper, something that made my stomach churn slightly, but I immediately attributed it to Emily or Jake. Maybe one of them was having a bad dream. I got up slowly and checked the monitor. The cameras in the rooms showed the kids sleeping, motionless. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I decided it was probably just my imagination, something I barely heard, and that the exhaustion of the week made me exaggerate. I went back to the couch, but the discomfort lingered. There was something about those whispers, something that didn't feel right. And even though I tried to convince myself everything was fine, a shiver ran down my spine, leaving me with an uneasy feeling. The discomfort only grew. Even trying to ignore it, I couldn't focus on what was on TV. Suddenly, the strange sound came again through the intercom, this time clearer. It sounded like a murmur, almost as if someone was whispering close to the microphone. I jumped off the couch, my heart racing. I went straight to the monitor and again looked at the images of the rooms. Jake was lying on his side, breathing heavily, but he seemed calm. Emily was face down, her head under the pillow. Nothing out of the ordinary, but the whispers continued. They weren't coming from either of the kids' rooms. They were fast asleep. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down. Maybe it was some kind of interference, a problem with the intercom system. I slowly walked through the house, first going to Emily's room. I opened the door slowly and peeked inside. The room was dark, lit only by the faint light of the night coming through the window. Emily was exactly where I had left her, sound asleep. Without making any noise, I backed out and headed to Jake's room. As I opened the door, I felt the same relief. He was also sleeping peacefully, with one arm hanging off the bed. I whispered to myself that I was being paranoid. I convinced myself that maybe I was just hearing things because I was alone in such a big house. I closed the door slowly and was about to head back to the living room when I heard something different. A creak. It came from the hallway downstairs. My body froze for a second. A chill ran down my spine, and the feeling that something was really wrong took hold of me. I walked slowly to the top of the stairs, trying to listen more closely. The sound was clear, like someone had touched one of the furniture pieces or pushed something. Suddenly, the intercom in my hand crackled again, and the sound I heard made my blood run cold. It was a moan, low and drawn out, followed by something that sounded like heavy breathing. I stood there, trying to understand what was happening. Had someone broken into the house? Was there someone downstairs, lurking in the shadows? My thoughts raced a mile a minute. Fear took hold, but I knew I needed to act. The kids were upstairs, defenseless. I had to protect them. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and opened the dialer app. But before I could call the police, another sound echoed through the house, a sharp noise like something had fallen to the floor. The intercom crackled again, and then for the first time, I heard something I couldn't ignore, a voice, low, almost indistinguishable but present. It wasn't either of the kids. With Emily in my arms, I ran to Jake's room and gently shook him awake. His eyes could barely focus, still drowsy, but the urgency in my voice woke him up completely. "We need to go, Jake. Now," I whispered, trying not to let my panic show. He nodded, confused, but trusting me. The three of us left the room in silence, and I led them to the bathroom at the end of the hallway, the only place with a strong lock. I locked the door and turned to the kids. "Stay quiet, no matter what happens," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake, sensing the seriousness of the situation, just held Emily's hand, who was still half asleep. I grabbed my phone again and finally dialed 911. The sound of the ringing felt like it lasted forever. Then, I heard a voice on the other end. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in the house, I whispered, my body shaking. I'm locked in the bathroom with 2 kids. Please, send the police, quickly. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line, but at that moment I heard a crash, the sound of something heavy hitting the bathroom door. The person was right outside. The intruder knew where we were. My heart nearly stopped, but I knew I had to be strong for the kids. The police are on their way, the dispatcher repeated. But I knew that with the intruder so close, they might not arrive in time. The door shook again, this time with more force. I held the handle, trying to keep it shut, but I could feel the pressure from the other side. Jake started to cry, and Emily finally woke up fully, panic growing in her eyes. Stay behind me, I ordered, trying to think of something, anything that could protect us. Then the banging stopped. The silence was so sudden, it caught me off guard. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear any movement. Nothing. Just the sound of my heavy breathing and the kids' sobs. After a few unbearable seconds, I heard sirens in the distance. They were getting closer. A wave of relief washed over me, but it still wasn't enough. The intruder could be waiting, just hiding until the police left. When the sirens were close, the front door was busted open. I heard voices, loud and authoritative, shouting for someone to surrender. I pulled the kids closer to me, expecting the worst. Minutes felt like hours until I heard footsteps on the other side of the bathroom door. A police officer shouted, "Police, we're here! You're safe now!" I opened the door with trembling hands, and there they were, armed and ready. The sight of the blue uniforms made me collapse in relief. The intruder was found hiding in the basement, still trying to escape. I never found out what he wanted or what he planned to do, but the important thing is that he didn't get the chance to hurt anyone. I've always enjoyed spending time outdoors, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. Last weekend, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time: go camping alone. Or rather, just me and Reggie, my faithful Labrador. I chose a remote forest, known for its beauty and isolation, exactly what I wanted: peace and quiet. We arrived there late in the morning. The air was crisp, and the sound of the leaves rustling in the wind was almost hypnotic. After hiking for a while, I found the perfect spot to set up camp, right next to a stream, surrounded by tall trees that gave us a sense of security. I pitched the tent, set up a campfire, and spent the rest of the afternoon relaxing, listening to the sound of the running water, while Reggie explored the area, always coming back to my side with that joyful look on his face. As the sun began to set, the forest around us grew quieter. The sounds of birds were replaced by the occasional noise of some nocturnal animal. But none of that bothered me. It was exactly what I expected from a night of camping. After a simple dinner, I sat by the campfire, gazing at the stars while Reggie curled up at my feet, content and sleepy. However, as night fully settled in, I started to feel a slight unease. I didn't know exactly what it was, but an unsettling feeling that something was off began to creep in. Reggie, usually calm and laid back, also seemed a bit more alert than usual. He would get up from time to time, sniff the air, and then lie back down, but he never fully relaxed. Even so, I ended up ignoring this feeling. After all, we were in a forest. It's normal to hear strange noises and feel like you're being watched, especially when you're alone. I went into the tent, wrapped myself in the sleeping bag, and tried to rest, while Reggie settled at my feet. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise outside the tent. It was a low sound, like something dragging over the dry leaves. Reggie, who had been sleeping soundly, immediately lifted his head, the fur on his neck bristling. I lay there, motionless, trying to figure out what could be causing that sound. After a few minutes of absolute silence, the noise returned, this time closer. A soft rustling, followed by a faint click, like someone was fiddling with something metal. My heart started to race. I slowly sat up and reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. With a trembling hand, I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the tent's zipper. Reggie was now on his feet, staring intently at the entrance, a low growl escaping from his throat. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make any noise. The zipper gleamed under the flashlight, and the sound of it opening seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. I stepped out of the tent and shone the light around the area. Everything seemed to be in order, but the ground near the campfire showed signs of something different. My belongings had been disturbed. The sleeping bag I left next to the tent was tossed on the ground, and the pot I used to cook was turned upside down, with the leftovers scattered around. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I tried to rationalize. Maybe an animal had wandered close during the night, looking for food, but something didn't add up. The objects were too neatly disturbed, as if someone had deliberately tampered with them. Reggie kept sniffing the air, restless, and occasionally barking at the emptiness. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting next to Reggie with the flashlight on. I kept trying to hear anything that might indicate someone or something was nearby, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I dozed off, waking up to the sun already rising. The next morning, everything seemed normal again, but the memory of the previous night was fresh in my mind. Even so, I decided to continue camping. It was only the first day and I didn't want to let fear take over, but as the day went on, the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods never went away. On the second night, the noises intensified. I heard footsteps around the tent, and this time there was no mistaking it. They were human, heavy, and deliberate. I quickly got up, grabbing a knife I brought for emergencies. Reggie, once again on high alert, growled in the direction of the tent's entrance. I waited, holding my breath, trying to listen more closely. The footsteps continued, circling the campsite. But what truly terrified me was what I found in the morning. Human footprints around the campsite, large and deep, proving that someone had been watching me during the night while I tried to sleep. On the final night, the tension was palpable. Even before nightfall, I could already sense something was wrong. Reggie, who was usually playful and full of energy, was nervous, pacing back and forth, sniffing the air and letting out small whines. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, but the truth was I couldn't relax. The sun had only been down for a few hours when I heard the first sound that froze me in place, a scream, loud and anguished, coming from deep within the forest. It was human, no doubt, but it carried a desperation I had never heard before. My heart raced, and Reggie started barking uncontrollably. I jumped to my feet, gripping the knife tightly. The scream was followed by another, even closer. It was like someone was running through the forest, screaming for help, but the voice was distorted, as if something or someone was chasing that person. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps running toward my tent, crunching dry leaves and snapping branches. Something or someone was coming straight for my tent. With terror overtaking me, I knew I couldn't just stand there waiting. "Let's go, Reggie!" I shouted as I began tossing essentials into my backpack. Reggie was frantic, barking non-stop, as if he wanted to warn me about the approaching danger. The footsteps and screams were getting closer. There was no more time. I grabbed the backpack, took hold of Reggie's leash, and we bolted down the trail. The tent's zipper was still open, but I didn't care. We needed to get out of there. We ran in the darkness, with the flashlight shaking in my hand, illuminating just enough to avoid tripping over roots. The sound of the footsteps and screams continued to follow us, getting closer and closer. I knew that whatever was out there wouldn't stop until it caught up to us. When I finally saw my car, it was like seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. I sprinted with all my might, Reggie pulling with all his energy beside me. We reached the car, and I unlocked the door with trembling hands. Reggie jumped in, and I quickly followed, slamming the door and starting the engine in one swift motion. As I sped down the dirt road, I heard one last scream echo through the forest, louder and more desperate than all the others. I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a brief second, I saw an indistinct figure at the edge of the road standing still watching me. I couldn't make out who or what it was, but its presence sent a chill so intense down my spine that I almost lost control of the car. I drove at high speed until I reached civilization, only slowing down when I was miles away from that forest. Reggie was by my side, still nervous, but relieved that we were far from that place. My name is Jack, and I've always loved rainy nights. There's something comforting about the sound of rain tapping against the windows, the feeling of being safe inside while the world outside turns into a blur of water and shadows. That night, I was home alone in an old house full of dark corners and long hallways. Even so, it was the place I grew up, where I had always felt safe. The night was late. I had spent the entire day wrapped up in work and finally had some time to relax. I settled into bed with a book, leaving the bedroom window slightly open to hear the rain better. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of the water falling outside. I was engrossed in my reading when I first heard a noise coming from downstairs. It was subtle, something that could easily be ignored, a faint creak, maybe the wind pushing against a window not fully closed. I tried to go back to my book, convinced it was nothing. But then the sound came back, a bit louder this time. I closed the book and sat up in bed, trying to listen more closely. The creaking repeated, followed by a muffled noise, as if something had been moved. I knew the house made strange noises, especially during a storm, but this sound was different. It felt deliberate. With a sigh, I decided to check it out. I got out of bed, went to the bedroom door, and opened it slowly. The hallway was dark, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning, briefly illuminating the walls and furniture. I carefully walked down the stairs, the steps creaking under my weight. When I reached the bottom floor, the house was silent again, except for the constant sound of rain. I looked around, trying to find something out of place, but everything seemed normal. I checked the doors and windows, and they were all locked, just as I had left them. Convincing myself I was just being paranoid, I went back to the bedroom, trying to recapture the comfort from before. I closed the bedroom door and lay down, but the uneasiness wouldn't leave me. I left the lamp on and tried to read a little more, but the sounds of the house now seemed more present, as if something or someone was moving in the shadows. Then I heard the noise again, no longer a creak, but the clear sound of footsteps coming directly from downstairs. A chill ran down my spine. I was no longer alone in the house. My heart began to race. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if the person was trying not to make any noise but was failing. It was impossible to ignore the sound of something or someone moving downstairs. I froze for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do. I could feel sweat forming on my hands as I tried to think. I was sure I had locked all the doors and windows. How could someone have gotten in? And why? I thought about going downstairs again to investigate, but the idea of facing an intruder was terrifying. Instead, I walked back to the bedroom door, opening it slowly to try and listen more closely. The footsteps continued, but now they were closer, moving up the stairs. Panic set in. I rushed back into the room and quickly locked the door. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the key. I stood there, ear pressed to the door, listening to the sound of the footsteps approaching. The person was coming up the stairs, one step at a time, as if they knew exactly where I was. I needed to act quickly. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and called the police. The wait was agonizing as the phone rang. Finally, a voice answered on the other end, and I spoke as quietly as possible, trying not to attract the intruder's attention. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in my house. They're downstairs. They're coming up. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line, assuring me that the police were on their way, but by then, my panic was at its peak. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. The silence was so deep that I could hear my own heavy breathing. The weight was suffocating, the silence oppressive. I stood there, motionless, expecting the worst. I held onto the phone tightly, ready to use anything I could as a defense. All I could hear was the rain and the muffled sound of my own breathing. The intruder was on the other side of the door, I was sure of it. But then, without any warning, the footsteps started to retreat. The sound grew more distant until it disappeared completely. The 911 operator was still on the line, reassuring me, saying the police were just minutes away. But the fear was so overwhelming that I couldn't move, waiting for the sound to return at any moment. Finally, the police arrived, their sirens cutting through the night's silence. They entered the house, and I heard them giving orders. But when they opened the door to my bedroom and found me, everything was quiet. The intruder had vanished. When the officers entered the room, the adrenaline was still coursing through my body. I was leaning against the wall, trying to calm down. They asked me what had happened, and I explained everything. The footsteps, the noises from downstairs, and how the intruder had stopped right outside my door. The police quickly began to search the house. They checked every room, every corner, every closet, but they found no one. It was as if the person had vanished. However, when they reached the kitchen downstairs, they found a window open, the curtain wet from the rain, swaying in the wind. This didn't make sense. I was sure I had locked all the windows before going to bed. The older officer told me it was possible the intruder had forced the window open to get in and then left through it when they realized I had called the police. But what really unsettled me was the fact that despite having been inside the house, nothing had been stolen. Nothing was out of place, except for the open window and the cold feeling lingering in the air. After searching the house and the area around it, the police found no further signs of the intruder. They told me to stay alert and to call immediately if anything else strange happened. Before they left, one of them suggested I spend the night somewhere else, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep anywhere that night. As soon as the police left, the silence returned to the house, but this time it wasn't comforting. Every creak of the walls, every distant noise of the rain seemed amplified, as if the house were alive, pulsing with the fear I felt. I found myself revisiting every detail of the night, wondering how someone could have gotten in and out so easily. The open window was a constant reminder that I wasn't as safe as I thought. I ended up not sleeping. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, holding my phone in my hand, with the feeling that at any moment I might hear those footsteps again. The first light of morning brought some relief, but the fear and unease remained. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with the security of the house. I bought new locks, installed security cameras, and checked every window and door multiple times before allowing myself to relax. But even with all these precautions, the feeling of vulnerability stayed with me. The experience of that night left a deep mark. I had underestimated the security of my own home, a place I had always considered my refuge. Now, every night was a reminder of the fragility of that security and how a simple mistake, like a window left slightly unlocked, could turn a peaceful night into a nightmare. Since then, I've never gone to bed without checking every lock, every window, and no matter how hard I try, I've never been able to completely shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The intruder may have disappeared that night, but the fear they left behind remains, haunting every moment I'm alone in the house. I recently landed a job as a night security guard at one of the most famous antique shops in the city. The place was enormous, almost like a museum, filled with historical artifacts and rare jewels that seemed to belong to another era. On my first day, the owner, Mr. Harrison, called me in for a chat. He was an elderly man with sharp, careful eyes. As he showed me the store's security system, he talked about the importance of vigilance. These items, Lucas, are worth more than money. Some of them have centuries of history. We've had recent attempts at theft, which is why we've hired additional security. I trust you'll take this seriously. And I did. The system was impressive. Motion sensors, cameras in every corner, alarms that would go off at the slightest sign of suspicious movement. This was my first job in such a position, and I was determined not to disappoint. As the shift began, the store fell silent. Only the occasional sound of the wind outside broke the quiet. I spent the first few hours walking through the corridors, familiarizing myself with the exhibition rooms and security procedures. Each piece there seemed to tell a story, and there was something almost mystical about being surrounded by so many ancient objects, especially at night. As the night progressed, I started to feel more at ease. The store was large, with several rooms, some quite isolated, but everything seemed peaceful. Mr. Harrison had mentioned that sometimes the sensors triggered false alarms, so when the first night passed without incident, I felt confident, but remained cautious. Shortly after midnight, the motion sensors went off. The sharp sound of the alarm echoed through the store, making me jump out of my chair. I looked at the security cameras, expecting to see some movement, but the screens only showed empty rooms. My heart was racing, but I tried to remember what Mr. Harrison had said about false alarms. Still, something didn't feel right. I decided to check it out myself. Grabbing a flashlight, I left the control room and walked through the silent corridors. The store, which had previously felt like a place full of history, now had a more ominous atmosphere. Every shadow cast by the artifacts made me question what might be lurking. I reached the room where the alarm had gone off, one of the most isolated in the store. I looked around, and at first glance, everything seemed normal. But then something caught my eye. One of the most valuable items, an ancient gold artifact, seemed to be out of place, slightly moved from its original position. I was sure that during my last round, it had been perfectly aligned. My breathing became heavier. Someone had been there, someone who knew what they were doing. I quickly returned to the control room and reviewed the camera footage from the past few days. That's when I saw it. A hooded figure moving through the store at different times, always in the less monitored areas. There was no denying it. This person was planning something big. Now, my greatest fear was that the thief was still in the store. I knew that calling the police might push them to do something desperate, possibly even damaging the priceless pieces, but standing by wasn't an option either. I decided to do another round, this time more thoroughly, checking every room and inspecting every corner. My body was tense, senses heightened. As I walked, I started to hear something, a muffled sound coming from one of the restoration rooms. My heart nearly stopped. The restoration room was supposed to be locked. I walked slowly towards it, holding the flashlight in one hand and a fire extinguisher I had found along the way in the other. As I got closer, I saw the door was slightly ajar, with a sliver of light escaping. With the flashlight in one hand and the fire extinguisher in the other, I pushed the door to the restoration room, trying not to make a sound. The light inside the room was dim, barely illuminating the shelves filled with pieces under repair. At the back of the room, with his back to me, was the intruder. He was wearing a dark hood and was crouched down, trying to open a small safe where Mr. Harrison temporarily kept the rare jewels. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I knew I had to act quickly. Without thinking much, I took a few steps forward, the fire extinguisher raised. At the last second, the thief sensed my presence and turned around, the light of my flashlight reflecting in his eyes. "Stop right there," I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I actually felt. The thief hesitated, assessing the situation, but then decided to run. He jumped up and tried to push past me through the door. I reacted instinctively, swinging the extinguisher in his direction. The blow struck his shoulder, making him stumble backward. He lost his balance, knocking over some tools that were on a nearby table. Adrenaline was fueling me, and I couldn't let him escape. As he recovered, I managed to grab his arm and shoved him against the wall. He struggled, trying to break free, but I wasn't going to give up. I held on tightly, using all the strength I had to keep him pinned. "I called the police," I lied, hoping it would make him stop fighting. He paused for a second, his eyes locked on mine. I realized he was weighing his options. Then, suddenly, he tried to punch me to break free. The blow grazed me, but it caused me to drop the flashlight, which fell to the floor and went out. The room was almost completely dark, with only the faint light of the moon coming through the window. Now, at a disadvantage, I realized I needed real help. Finally, I pulled out my phone and, still holding onto the thief with one hand, called the police with the other. "I need help now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while the thief squirmed to escape. The struggle continued until, finally, I heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. The thief seemed to realize that time was running out. He made one last effort to break free, but at that moment, the police burst into the store, their lights flooding the restoration room. "Police, hands up!" they shouted, pointing their weapons at the intruder. The thief finally gave up, letting his hands drop to his sides as the officers moved in to arrest him. I was exhausted, breathing heavily, but relieved that it was all over without anything being damaged. After everything calmed down, Mr. Harrison arrived at the store, having been notified by the police. He gave me a pat on the back, a rare smile on his face. "You did a great job, Lucas. You saved the store and the most valuable pieces we have.